This is not an artistically rounded-off ghost story, and nothing in it is explained, and there seems to be no reason why any of it should have happened. But that is no reason for it not to be told. You must have noticed that all the real ghost stories you have ever heard are like this in some way. No explanation, no logical coherence. Here is the story. There were 3 of us, and another. But she had fainted suddenly at the second extra of the Christmas dance and been put to bed. She was in the dressing room next to the room which we 3 shared. It had been one of those jolly old-fashioned dances where nearly everybody stays the night, and the big country house had been stretched to its limits. There were people sleeping on the sofas, the couches, the settles, even just mattresses on the floor. Some of the young men actually slept on the great dining table, so I heard. We had talked of our partners, as girls will, and then the stillness of the manor house, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the cedar branches and the scraping of their fingers against our window panes, had pricked us to such luxurious confidence in our surroundings of bright chintz and candle flame and firelight that we began to talk of ghosts, in which we all said we did not believe one bit. We had told the story of the phantom coach and the horribly strange bed and the lady in the sack and the house in Berkeley Square. We none of us believed in ghosts, but my heart at least seemed to leap to my throat and choke me there when a tap came to our door. A faint tap, not to be mistaken. "Who's there?" said the youngest of us, craning a neck towards the door. It opened slowly, and I give you my word, in the instance of suspense that followed, it is still reckoned amongst my least confident of moments. Almost at once the door opened fully, and Miss Eastwick, my aunt's housekeeper, looked in on us. We all said, "Well, come in," but she stood there. She was, at all normal hours, the most silent woman I have ever known. She stood and looked at us and shivered a little. So did we, for the corridors in those days were not heated by hot water pipes, and the air from the door was keen. "I saw your light," she said at last, "and I thought it was late for you to be up after all this gaiety. I thought perhaps—" And her glance turned towards the door of the dressing-room. "No," I said. "She is fast asleep." I should have added a good night, but the youngest of all forestalled my speech. She did not know Miss Eastwick as we others did not know her persistent silence had built a wall around her, a wall that no one dared to break down with commonplaces of talk or the littleness of mere human relationship. Miss Eastwick's silence had taught us to treat her as a machine, and as other than a machine we never dreamed of treating her. But the youngest of us had seen Miss Eastwick for the first time that day. She was young, crude, ill-mannered, subject to blind, calf-like impulses. She was also the heiress of a rich tallow chandler, but that has nothing to do with this part of the tale. She jumped from the hearth rug and ran to the door and put an arm around Miss Eastwick's prim, lace-encircled neck. I gasped. I should have soon dared to embrace Cleopatra's Needle. "Come in," said the youngest of us. "Come in and get warm. There's lots of cocoa left." And she drew Miss Eastwick in and shut the door. The vivid light of pleasure in the housekeeper's pale eyes went through my heart like a knife. It would have been so easy to put an arm around her neck, if only one had thought she had wanted an arm there. But it was not I who had thought that, and indeed my arm might not have brought the light invoked by the thin arm of the youngest of us. "Now," the youngest went on eagerly. You shall have the very biggest, nicest chair, and the cocoa pot's here, and the hob is as hot as hot. And when you get warm, you should tell us ghost stories. We don't believe in them one bit, but we've been telling them too. Miss Eastwich, that model of decorum, tell a ghost story? You're sure I'm not in your way? Said Miss Eastwich, stretching her arms out towards the flames. I wonder whether housekeepers have fires in their rooms even at Christmas time. Not a bit, I said, and I hope she felt it as warmly as I said it. Miss Eastwich, I'd have asked you to come in other times, only I didn't think you'd care for the girls' chatter. The third girl poured cocoa for our guest, and I put my fleecy Madeira shawl around her shoulders. I could not think of anything else to do for her, and I found myself desperately wishing to do something. The smiles she gave us were quite pretty. People can smile prettily at 40 or 50 or even later. The girls don't realise that. It occurred to me, and this was another knife thrust, that I had never seen Miss Eastwich smile. A real smile before, that is. The pale smiles of dutiful acquiescence were not of the same blood as this happy, transfiguring look. This is very pleasant, she said, and it seemed to me that I had never before heard her real voice. It did not please me to think that at the cost of a cup of cocoa, a fire, and my arm around her neck, that I might have heard this new voice at any time during the last 6 years. We've been telling ghost stories, I said. The worst of it is we don't believe in ghosts. No one we know has ever seen one. It's always what somebody told somebody who told somebody, you know, said the youngest of us, and you can't believe that, can you? What the soldier said is no evidence, said Miss Eastwich. Will it be believed that the little Dickens quotation pierced one more keenly than the new smile or the new voice? And all the ghost stories are so beautifully rounded off. A murder committed on the spot, or a hissing treasure, or a warning. I think that makes them harder to believe. The most horrid ghost story I ever heard was one that was quite silly. Tell it? I can't. It doesn't sound anything to tell. Miss Eastwich ought to tell one. Oh, do, said the youngest of us, and her salt-cellars loomed dark as she stretched her neck eagerly and laid an entreating arm on our guest's knee. The only thing that I ever knew of was hearsay, she said slowly, till just the end. I knew she would tell her story, and I knew she had never told it before. And I knew she was only telling it now because she was proud, and this seemed the only way to pay for the fire and the cocoa and the laying of the arm around the neck. Don't tell it, I said suddenly. I know you'd rather not. I dare say it would bore you, she said meekly, and the youngest of us, who, after all, did not understand everything, glared at me. We should just love it, she said. Do tell. Never mind if it isn't a real, proper, fixed-up ghost story. I'm certain anything you think ghostly would be quite too beautifully horrid for anything. Miss Eastwich finished her coffee and reached up to set the cup on the mantel. I can't do any harm, she said, almost to herself. They don't believe in ghosts, and it wasn't exactly a ghost story over, and they're all over 20. They're not babies. There was a breathing time of hush and expectancy. The fire crackled, and the gas suddenly glared higher because the billiard lights had been put out. We heard the steps and voices of the men going along the corridor. It is really hardly worth telling, Miss Eastwich said doubtfully, shading her faded face from the fire with her thin hand. We all said, go on, do. Well, she said, 20 years ago, and more than that, I had 2 friends, and I loved them more than anything in the world. And they married each other. And she paused, and I knew in just what way she had loved each of them. The youngest of us said, "How awfully nice for you. Do go on." And she patted the youngest's shoulder, and I was glad that I had understood, and that the youngest hadn't. She went on. "Well, after they were married, I did not see much of them for a year or 2, and then he wrote and asked me to come and stay because his wife was ill, and I should cheer her up, and cheer him up as well, for it was a gloomy house, and he himself was growing gloomy too." I knew, as she spoke, that she knew every line of that letter by heart. Well, I went. The address was in Lee, near London, and in those days there were streets of brand new villa houses growing up around old brick mansions standing in their own grounds, with a sort of flavour of coaching days and post-chaises and highwaymen about them. He had said that the house was gloomy, and it was called the Firs, and I imagined my cab going through a dark, winding shrubbery and drawing up in front of these old, sedate, square houses. Well, instead, we drew up in front of a large, smart villa with iron railings and tiles leading up to the front door with stained glass panelling, with only a few stunted cypresses and acubas in the tiny front garden. But inside it was warm and welcoming. He met me at the door. She was gazing into the fire, and I knew she had forgotten us. But the girl youngest of us all still thought it was us to whom she was telling her story. "He met me at the door," she said again, "and thanked me for coming and asked me to forgive the past." "What past?" said the high priestess of inappropriateness, the youngest of us all. "Oh, I suppose he meant because they hadn't invited me before or something," Miss Eastwich said worriedly. "It's a very dull story, and after all—" "Do go on," I said. And then I kicked the youngest of us and got up to rearrange Miss Eastwick's shawl and said in a blatant dumb show over the shawled shoulder, "Shut up, you little idiot." After another silence, the housekeeper's voice went on. "They were very glad to see me, and I was glad to be there. You girls now have such troops of friends, but these 2 were all I had. All I ever had. Mabel wasn't exactly ill, only weak and excitable, and I thought he seemed more ill than she did. She went to bed early, and before she went to bed she asked me to keep him company through his last pipe. So we went into the dining room and sat in 2 armchairs each side of the fireplace. They were covered in green leather, I remember that, and there were bronze groups of horses on the mantelpiece, along with a black marble clock, all wedding presents. He poured out some whiskey for himself, but he hardly touched it, and he sat looking into the fire. At last I said, "What's wrong? Mabel looks as well as you could expect." And he said yes. "But I don't know from one day to another that she won't begin to notice something wrong. That's why I wanted you to come. You were always so sensible and strong-minded, and Mabel's she's like a little bird on a flower." I said yes, of course, and waited for him to go on. I thought he must be in debt or in trouble of some sort, so I just waited, and presently he said, "Margaret, this is a very peculiar house." He always called me Margaret. You see, we'd been such old friends. I told him I thought that the house was very pretty and fresh and homelike, only a little too new, but that faltered men with time. He said, "It is new, and that's just it. We're the first people who've ever lived in it. If it were an old house, Margaret, I should think it was haunted." I asked if he had seen anything, and he said no, not yet. "Well, heard, then," I said. "No, not heard either," he said, "but there's a sort of feeling. I can't describe it. I've seen nothing. I've heard nothing, but I have been so near to seeing something. There's something that follows me about, only when I turn round, there's never anything, only my shadow. And I always feel that I shall see the thing the next minute, but I never do. Not quite. It's not quite visible. I thought he'd been rocking rather hard, and I tried to cheer him up by making light of it all. It was just nerves, I said. Then he said he had thought I could help him, and did I think anyone he had wronged could have laid a curse on him, and did I believe in curses? I said I didn't, and the only person anyone could have said he had wronged forgave him freely. I knew if there was anything to forgive, so I told him this too. And it was I, not the younger, who knew the name of that person wronged, and who was forgiving. So then I said, you ought to take Mabel away from the house and have a complete change, but he said no. Mabel had got everything in order, and he could never manage to get her away just now without explaining everything, and above all, she mustn't guess there is anything wrong. I dare say I shan't feel quite such a lunatic now you're here. So we said good night. Is that all the story? Said the third girl, striving to convey that, even as it stood, it was a good story. That's only the beginning, said Miss Eastwich. Whenever I was alone with him, he used to tell me the same thing, over and over again, and at first when I began to notice things, I tried to think that it was his talk that had upset my nerves. The odd thing was that it wasn't only at night, it was also in broad daylight, particularly on the stairs and in the passages. On the staircase, the feeling used to be so awful that I used to have to bite my lip till it bled to keep me from running upstairs at full speed, only I knew that if I did, I should go mad at the top. There was always something behind me, exactly as he had said, something that one could not just see. And a sound that one could not hear. There was a long corridor at the top of the house, and I have sometimes almost seen something. You know how one sees things without looking? But if I turned around, it seemed as if the thing dropped and melted into my shadow. There was a little window at the end of the corridor. Downstairs there was another corridor, something like it, with a cupboard at one end and a kitchen at the other. One night I went down into the kitchen to heat some milk for Mabel. The servants had gone to bed, and as I stood by the fire waiting for the milk to boil, I glanced through the open door and along the passage. The cupboard door was slightly open. They used to keep empty boxes and things in it, and as I looked, I knew now that it was not going to be almost any more. Yet I said, Mabel? Not because I thought it could be Mabel, who was crouching down there, half in, half out of the cupboard. The thing was grey at first, and then it was black, and when I whispered Mabel, it seemed to sink down till it lay like a pool of ink on the floor, and then its edges drew in, and it seemed to flow like ink gathered when you tilt the paper, when you've spilt it, and it flowed into the cupboard till it was all gathered in the shadow there. I saw it go, quite plainly. The gas was on full in the kitchen, and I screamed out loud. But even then, I'm thankful to say I had enough sense to upset the boiling milk so that when he came running down the stairs 3 at a time, I had the excuse for my scream of a scalded hand. This explanation satisfied Mabel, but the next night he said, "Why didn't you tell me? It was that cupboard. All the horror in this house comes from that cupboard." Tell me, have you seen anything yet? Or is it only the nearly seeing and the nearly hearing still? I said, first you must tell me what you have seen. He told me, and his eyes wandered as he spoke to the shadows by the curtains. And I turned up all 3 gas lights and lit the candles on the mantelpiece. Then we looked at each other and said we were both mad, and thank God that Mabel at least was sane. For what he had seen was what I had seen. After that, I hated to be alone with a shadow, because at any moment I might see something that would crouch and sink and lie like a black pool, and then slowly draw itself into the shadow that was nearest. And often that shadow was my shadow. The thing came first at night, but afterwards there was no safe hour from it. I saw it at dawn, and at noon, in the dusk and in the firelight, and it always crouched and sank, and it was a pool that flowed into some shadow and became part of it. And always I saw it with a straining of my eyes, a pricking and an aching. It seemed as though I could only just see it, as if my sight to see it had to be strained to the uttermost. And still the sound was also in the house, the sound that I could not just hear. At last, one morning early, I did hear it. It was close behind me. And it was only a sigh. But that sigh was worse than the thing in the shadows. I don't know how I bore it. I couldn't have borne it if I hadn't been so fond of them both. But I knew in my heart that if he had no one with whom he could speak openly, he would go mad or tell Mabel. He was not a very strong character, very sweet, very kind and gentle, not strong. He was always easily led. So I stayed on and bore up, and we were very cheerful, and we made little jokes, and we tried to be amusing when Mabel was with us. But when we were alone, we did not try to be amusing. And sometimes a day or two would pass, and without seeing or hearing anything, and we should perhaps have fancied that we had imagined what we had seen and what we had heard, only there was always that feeling of there being something in the house that one could just not hear and not see. Sometimes we used to try not to talk about it, but generally we talked of nothing else at all, and the weeks went by, and Mabel's baby was born. The nurse and the doctor said that both mother and child were doing well. He and I sat late in the dining room that night. We had neither of us seen or heard anything for 3 days. Our anxiety about Mabel was lessened. We talked of the future. It seemed then so much brighter than the past. We arranged that the moment she was fit to be moved, he should take her away to the sea, and I should superintend the moving of their furniture into a new house, that he had already chosen. He was gayer than I had seen him since his marriage, and almost like his old self. When I said good night to him, he said a lot of things about my having been a comfort to them both. I hadn't done much, of course, but I am still glad he said them. Then I went upstairs, almost for the first time without that feeling of something following me. I listened at Mabel's door, and all was quiet. And so I went on towards my own room, and in an instant I felt that there was something behind me. I turned. It was crouching there. It sank, and the black fluidness of it seemed to be sucked under the door of Mabel's bedroom. I went back. I opened the door, listening inch, and was still. And then I heard a sigh behind me. I opened the door and went in. The nurse and the baby were asleep. Mabel was asleep too. She looked so pretty, like a tired child. And the baby was cuddled up into one of her arms with its tiny head against her side. And I prayed then that Mabel might never know the terrors that he and I had known, that those little ears may never hear anything but pretty sounds, and those little eyes never see anything but pretty sights. I did not dare to pray again for a long time after that, because my prayer was answered. She never saw and never heard anything more in this world, and now I could do nothing more for her. When they had put her in her coffin, I lighted wax candles around her and laid the horrible white flowers that people will send her. And then I saw that he had followed me, and I took his hand and led him away. At the door, we both turned, for it seemed to us we heard a sigh. He would have sprung to her side in I don't know what mad, glad hope, but in that instant we both saw it. Between us and the coffin, first grey, then black. It crouched in an instant, and then it sank, liquefied, and was gathered together and drawn till it ran into the nearest shadow. And the nearest shadow was the shadow of Mabel's coffin. I left the next day. His mother came. She had never liked me. Miss Eastwich paused. I think she had quite forgotten us. "Didn't you see him again?" the youngest one said. "Only once," Miss Eastwich answered, and something black crouched between then him and me. But it was only his second wife crying beside his coffin. It's not a cheerful story, is it? And it doesn't lead anywhere. I've never told anyone. I think it was seeing his daughter that brought it all back, and she looked towards the dressing-room door. Mabel's baby? Yes, and exactly like Mabel, only with his eyes. The youngest of all had Miss Eastwich's hands, and she was petting them. Suddenly, the woman wrenched her hands away and stood at her gaunt height, her hands clenched, her eyes straining. She was looking at something that we could not see, and I know what the man in the Bible said when he said, "The hair on my flesh stood up." What she saw seemed to not quite reach the handle of the dressing-room door. Her eyes followed it down, 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 widening and widening. Mine followed them. All the nerves of them seemed strained to the utmost. And I almost saw, or did I quite see? I can't be certain. But we all heard the long, drawn-out sigh. Quivering sigh, and to each of us it seemed to be breathed just behind us. It was I who caught up with the candle. It dripped all over my trembling hand and was dragged by Miss Eastwich to the girl who had fainted during the second extra. But it was the youngest of all whose lean arms were around the housekeeper when we turned away, and that have been around her many times since at the new home where she keeps house for the youngest of us all. The doctor, who came in the morning, said that Mabel's daughter had died from heart failure, inherited from her mother. It was that which had made her faint during the second extra. But I have sometimes wondered whether she did inherit something from her father. I have never been able to forget the look of the dead girl's face.